In this video, I will argue that voting for Parliament should be simple, favour large parties, be proportional on block level, and dynamic, allowing old parties to die and new ones to get in, and accordingly advocate a two-tier system for proportional parliamentary elections, where a party becomes pre-qualified if it's large enough. Other parties are assigned one of the pre-qualified parties as a base party based on polling. A generic ballot, the voter ticks a single party and votes are tallied per party. If a party is neither pre-qualified nor reaches the 10% cutoff, its votes are transferred to its pre-qualified base party. Currently in Swedish parliamentary elections, there is a 4% cutoff. If a party doesn't reach that, it does not get into parliament and the votes are thrown away. The system is otherwise proportional. If a tiny party takes votes away from an established party but doesn't get in, it would have been a spoiler for that established party and the votes wasted. To avoid losing votes to the cutoff, people avoid voting for new parties. But even worse, there are zombie parties, old, useless parties that are part of a coalition. Their coalition partners don't want to risk losing them and their votes, so their voters support the endangered ally. This means the small party survives in election after election, but depends on the goodwill of the larger parties in the bloc, and will obediently support them, making it a zombie party. The result is that there are currently 8 parties in the Swedish parliament, and that is just too many. Small parties tend to cater to their niche voter base, rather than looking at what is best for the country. There can be difficulty forming a government, which will normally involve multiple parties, backroom negotiations, and voters won't know which party is responsible for what. And the large number of parties also makes it difficult to start new parties. Not only are voters reluctant to throw their votes away on a party that probably won't make it into parliament, there's also that there are already so many parties for voters to choose from. Under the current parliamentary system established in 1971, no establishment party has properly dropped out of parliament. Miljöpartiet did have one-time miss in 1991, and a populist opposition party, Ny Demokrati, had a single term 1991 to 94, and then failed to make the cutoff. But that was not an establishment party, so they were not supported by other parties. By contrast, the establishment parties do not die, they become zombies. They give an appearance of meaningful choice. Most voters won't look any further and end up voting for another establishment party. So there's a little rotation in what parties there are. The system becomes stale. The parties are rotten clubs for internal admiration that are unlikely to be replaced. With my suggestion, higher cutoffs, but votes are transferred to the base party. Old parties would be allowed to die, so that there would be fewer parties in parliament, yet no spoiler effect. So it would be open for voters to vote for a new party, with more vibrant scene for new parties trying to get in. Another thing about Swedish elections are the ballots. There's no generic ballot. Each party has a ballot. It used to be that you picked the ballot out in the open, where others could see what party ballot you picked, without election secrecy. This has been changed to have privacy for that, but it massively slows down the voting with long lines, since people take longer to look for the ballot than to stuff it in an envelope. But most voters make a simple vote for a party, and do not need the specialized party ballot, where you can take the name of a specific candidate. Their voting would be faster, smoother, and with good election secrecy with a generic ballot. Having the party ballots as well is fine enough, but having only the party ballots is not working well. A generic ballot is needed. The voting mechanism for Parliament should be simple, favour large parties, be proportional on the block level, and be dynamic. Anything being done by the whole population should be kept simple. Ticking a single party should be sufficient. Votes should also be easy to count, with every polling station having a simple tally that they report publicly. If ballots become so complex that counting machines are introduced, then the risk of election rigging increases. One alternative system is ranked choice voting, where you don't just pick one party but indicate which is your first choice, second and third. While such systems are theoretically very nice, with many good properties, there is massive extra complexity. Anything that should be done by all the voters should be kept really simple. Also, such ballots do not allow simple tallying of the votes, reducing transparency, and might result in more counting machines being used, introducing hacking and other rigging risks. I don't see how this extra complexity would be justified compared to my suggestion. There are the odd cases where someone would like to vote for one party, but if that party doesn't get in, prefers the opposing bloc. This would be handled better by ranked choice than by my suggestion, but such oddities are not common, and the voter would normally simply vote for the party in the bloc they prefer. I would say that my suggestion get 80% of the benefit at 10% of the extra effort. Large parties are better because they need to cater to the general population, whereas tiny parties just need to appeal to their small bases. Do you see what I mean? Consider the case of social media content producer with a Patreon account. He depends on the approval of the tiny fraction of the population that watches his content, an even smaller fraction that supports him on Patreon. But the 99% plus that do not have little to no impact on him. If they get upset, it might even boost attention, and thus get him new supporters. So divisive political advocacy might work well. By contrast, if a company like Disney that wants normie families to see their movies in cinema, if they would alienate half the population with divisive politics, that would really hurt their brand. For the Parliament, you want the system to produce large parties that care about the big picture and not just appealing to a small base. Most members of Parliament will be loyal with their party. They depend on the party to have a chance to get elected. What matters to the party are those that might plausibly vote for the party. If a party has 1% of the vote locked in, and there's another 2% that seriously considers it, those are the 2% of the voters that the party, and thus the politician, will care about. Niche voters. But if a party has 30% locked in, and 20% that seriously considers it, it will care about those 20%. When the voter base is that large, they more or less represent the country. Normie voters and even median voters. What is good for such a big voter base is good for the country, and if something is bad for the country, it will likely alienate a big chunk of those voters. So you want the electoral system to favor large parties that care about the big picture rather than the niche parties. It's also a matter of simplicity and of accountability to the voters. If a government coalition of several parties govern poorly, then which party is to blame? Which of the policies caused the bad outcomes, and who was responsible for pushing them in the backroom deals? The parties will blame each other for negative outcomes, and the normal voters won't know. It is much better with large parties where it's common for just one party to form a government and thus be fully responsible for how they govern. Consider the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Early in its history, the cutoff was just 1%, with lots of tiny parties. The cutoff was increased in a number of steps to 3.25% before the 2015 election, making it similar to Sweden's 4%. But the legacy of having lots of tiny parties still linger, and tiny parties can get around the cutoff by making a joint list. And this defeats the purpose of the cutoff, allowing tiny parties to continue. The resulting glut of niche parties catering to niche voters make it difficult to form governments, as can be seen from Israel having had 5 elections in 4 years. The distortion in favor of large parties should not distort between political blocs. One of the most important outcomes of an election is which bloc, a set of collaborating parties, form the majority. If this is distorted so that a bloc that received a minority of the popular vote might get a majority of the parliamentary seats, this will be seen as illegitimate and also incentivize tactical voting, where people don't vote their conscience but to avoid quirks of the electoral system. The system should be proportional, such that the bloc that receives the most votes also wins. This means there should be no spoiler effect. If one side has one large party and the other consists of several small parties stealing votes from each other, the bloc should still maintain its proportion of parliamentary seats. Such spoiler effects discourage forming and voting for new parties, even when old ones have turned into clubs for internal admiration. Organizations tend to rot from the inside. Those who rule them control advancement within the party and end up with internal loyalties to the leadership rather than to the voters. Such loyalties become more important than competency or serving the people. And when folks complain about it, threatening to start a new party, they are told to not spoil the vote. In a dynamic system, voters could shift from such a party to an upstart, limiting how much insiders can get away with abusing their power before they start losing it. But if there are spoiler effects, where voting for a small upstart would mean throwing away your vote, then insiders have a lot more leeway to abuse their power. They need to alienate not just a few, but the bulk of their base, so that the new party gets enough momentum to be a real challenger. Only then do voters suddenly shift. In the UK, the mechanism to achieve the skew towards large parties is local election for single seats, where the local candidate with the most votes get the seat. This can massively distort proportionality. In 2024, Labour got 34% of the votes, but 63% of the seats. It is absurd to give such a huge mandate to a failing party. The Labour government does not have its mandate from the voters, but from the quirks of the voting system. There is also such a large spoiler effect that it is almost a two-party system. If you don't vote for one of the two real parties, you're throwing away your vote. Once insiders control those two parties, they are as difficult to reform as they are to replace, meaning that the insiders can stray very far from the will of the people, abusing their insider power, before they get replaced by a third party. The two-party system have demographically transformed the country, implemented racist two-tier policing to the point of having wide-scale, state-sanctioned racist rape gangs, supported for decades by both the Labour and the Tory parties. And it seems that might be enough to overcome the inertia of getting a new party, to replace one of the old ones. And even if that happens, it will in turn be controlled by a new set of insiders and thus have a large potential for abuse. So the UK system does favour large parties, but it's both disproportional and not at all dynamic. My suggestion is to have a set of pre-qualified large parties that are decided when it's time to print ballots. such parties that were one of the three largest or got at least 10% of the votes, either in the last election or would, according to recent polls. Each minor party is assigned a pre-qualified party that their voters prefer, according to polling, or the party itself chooses one of the pre-qualified parties. The generic ballots are just a list of parties, and you tick the single party. Tallying is a simple count per party. If a minor party gets over the cutoff, it gets into Parliament. Otherwise, the vote count is transferred to the pre-qualified base party. I believe this makes an efficient compromise between the different traits that are needed. We have simplicity, both for the ballots and for the tallying. Other mechanisms for having votes transferred, such as ranked choice voting, are much more complex. Yes, this simple mechanism lacks in flexibility. It only handles the most common case, but that gives the overwhelming majority of the benefit, allowing a large cutoff without spoiler effect. With a higher cutoff, 10% instead of Sweden's current 4%, there's a stronger preference for large parties, addressing the problem of there being too many small parties in the Swedish parliament. Old establishment parties that have rotted will not be saved by their allies, since the vote would not be lost. Even better, those votes would be consolidated to the main party, allowing a more efficient government with less coordination issues. So there would be fewer and larger parties. Proportionality is improved on the block level. If one party fails to make the cut, it doesn't upset the balance of power between the blocks, as the voters are transferred to the pre-qualified base party without spoiler effect. At the same time, it would be much more common to vote for a small new party trying to get in, since such votes would no longer be thrown away and there are no longer a glut of small, rotted old establishment parties to choose from. You would likely end up with a situation with 3 to 4 main parties, large enough to strive to attract normie voters, instead of settling for a special interest niche. Most of the main parties have some challenger trying to appeal to the same voter base, pressuring the main party to be loyal to their voters rather than to the establishment. So if insiders controlling an old main party defies the voters, it's easier for the voters to move to a new non-establishment party, making the system more dynamic with less inertia. Please let me and the algorithm know if there's a demand for more videos by liking, sharing, subscribing, or watching another video. Ceterum censeo paludum esse exorientam.